Hello everybody and welcome to our webinar today. Good that so many of you decided to join today. Today, interesting subject that we want to discuss during our webinar. The new CM70 family member, which now comes with NDI. Before we get started, just a couple of things as a little bit of housekeeping. We're using the Demio platform today. If you haven't used it before, welcome to this platform. Questions can be put in the chat window. We have team members from Avonic available to answer your questions today. So please feel free to put those in the chat window. Before we get started with today's webinar, if you're not familiar with Avonic and this is your first time attending one of our webinars, welcome. And we as Avonic, our company, founded about 13 years ago. Our background is in AV distribution and we are a manufacturer of PTZ cameras and fully in control about product design, manufacturing, warehousing, sales and support, all done from our HQ in the Netherlands. We have a very clear focus on the Pro AV installation world. So everywhere where the design of a camera is very important, where it needs to blend into the environment, is our key focus. And currently we have distribution in about 30 countries on every continent worldwide. So today, our CM70 NDI PTZ camera. We're very excited. We're in the last or the final stretch to get this product available to the market. And today we just want to give you a sneak preview on this new CM70 family member. So we're going to be talking about the camera itself, and then we're going to be talking about the move to IP. So what is the move for AV to go on existing IP networks, and how can we achieve that, and what are the elements you need to worry about? Why do we need standardized IP protocols? Of course, it makes life simpler, but there's more to it. And then we're going to be talking about what NDI HX brings to the table. A couple of applications. So how can you identify if the application itself is suitable to use NDI HX in? And we're also going to be talking about NDI tools that are available. And at the end of the webinar, I'm going to summarize everything for you. So in a quick overview of everything that we discussed during today's webinar. So first of all, our CM70 NDI, it is an additional functionality in a separate part number actually of our CM70 PTZ camera line. So it is a camera with 20 times zoom, with already low latency IP functionality, SRT support and fully IP controllable. It also supports a Tolly input, which is controllable over IP, which opens up a lot of different functionality that you can actually control through controllers or dedicated software. Significantly improved low light performance. It supports a unicast transfer stream mode, which is interesting for applications where multicast simply is not allowed on the network. It incorporates a high-speed pen tilt mode, which we've specifically added to the cameras for conferencing applications, where you want the camera to go as fast as possible from preset 1 to preset B, because basically that would be the time you need to get the next delegate into the picture. All our cameras in the CM70 series have extreme flexibility in terms of concurrent outputs. So we have IP streaming, we have USB 2.0, we have HDMI, we have SDI, and now also NDI HX inside of the CM70 NDI. We have multiple control possibilities, so you can control over RS-232, 485, UVC or IP, and also control of the PTZ through NDI HX. Most of the models are available in white and black, and they come with 3 years of warranty, which is backed up by a top-notch support team, which is actually located here in our HQ in the Netherlands. But I think the most important thing today is to understand where NDI HX comes into play into Pro AV applications and Pro AV installations. Of course, everybody's talking about the move to an all IP AV market. There's a lot of different terminology, a lot of different use cases, but in fact the move to IP comes down to making life simpler, making installation simpler. So how can you get audio, video, control and power over one single cable? So it's actually the one wire attempt. So getting everything to one single cable. And actually the next slide is an attempt, or at least my attempt, to position the different IP technologies for you. I have to warn you, I actually need to walk outside of the slide because otherwise there's just not enough room. So that's what I'm going to do now before we go to the next slide. Oops, go here. So this is all an attempt to explain to you where NDI HX comes into play. There's a lot of different marketing messages that we all get on a daily basis, but to go back to really understanding where NDI HX fit in, where other technologies fit in, we need to go back to where we work, well, probably at least 10 years ago. So the question is NDI yet another IP protocol? Of course, yes. The answer is yes. It is another IP protocol. But it does have some significant advantages which would make your installation and your customer's life easier. To go back to really understand this, we need to go back to traditional AV applications. So HDMI, HDBaseT, typically systems that were dedicated and used the HDMI cabling, matrix switchers, presentation switchers, those type of things. They're typically in the same room, so it's infrastructure in the same room, not so much on the same building or multiple levels or multiple buildings or even like a big campus. They focus on zero latency, basically only the latency that you would get from normal HDMI cables. And they use inside of those HDMI cables a very high bandwidth. So also on the backbone and the backplane of these devices, there's a very high throughput that goes through these devices. It's typically done with dedicated cabling, which basically means is that you would have HDMI cabling and separate control cables and separate power cables. It is very much standardized because it's been there for a while, and the interoperability is almost guaranteed because there's only a few cases where you would still see some issues. The move to IP is not just a simple move to IP. Hey, I'm going to do this on IP and that's it. No, there's so much protocols out there that it really is important to understand where the difference is between these protocols. So in this overview, which I'm not going to explain in detail because you just need to study this a little bit, and I promise you there's not a quiz or a test afterwards, but it positions the different general technologies that are available in the AV over IP space. What we would see as the AV over IP space now is the world of dedicated encoders and decoders. So where you had a matrix switcher with HDMI in and outputs, you now have a stack of encoders and a stack of decoders on the other side, where you're basically doing the same thing, but still you're using a different infrastructure. So you're doing everything over IP. So it's no dedicated cable from A to B. There is actually a virtual environment where you can route everything to everything. In these technologies, you'll see basically the terminology matrix, the IP reinvent, or the matrix invented, or the matrix over IP, or version 2.0 of the matrix switcher, all these type of terminologies. The technology behind these systems is typically JPEG 2000 or other very high bitrate compression schemes, but also technology like SDVoE. So good replacements for a matrix switcher. From a latency perspective, I already mentioned that with the traditional AV, we have zero latency, but still there's HDMI cables and devices that cause some latency. AV over IP technology, so SDVoE, J2K or JPEG 2000, typically have sub-millisecond delays up to like 30 milliseconds. But the bandwidth is still very high. So you're still looking at least 700 megabits of data, which is big and is not really easy to put on the same network. So it does use the standard infrastructure, but because of the high bandwidth, you'll go into things like a 10 gig network pretty easy. And also the control is done over IP, but basically still RS-232 carried over IP. The good and the bad thing about this technology is also it's typically vendor proprietary. So the encoders and decoders are optimized to each other to do the best or the lowest latency. Typically there's a dedicated management system, which is vendor proprietary as well. So you're kind of locked into this individual technology. So the thing to remember about this is typically proprietary, can be fine in a lot of applications, but really where you're focusing on very low latency applications, low latency requirements. And low latency is really close to zero. Low latency is one of those terminologies that is open for a lot of different perspectives. Low latency really for me is very low latency, so very close to what you would normally have when you take an SDI cable and connect to devices. Then how does NDI fit in? Within NDI, there's two flavors. So they're both NDI, but let's start with the one that is closest to the AV over IP world, so the SDVoE world. The high bandwidth NDI. Compared to the other two that I explained, it's FPGA based. There's still a piece of hardware in there, but it's a dedicated FPGA. The NDI codec actually uses something called intra-frame encoding, which is iframe only. So basically every frame is a real frame in the encoding space, where open standards such as H.264 would use with predictive frames, longer GOPs, these type of things. So really a frame that you see on the picture is a encoded frame inside of the NDI high bandwidth protocol. It uses about 125 megs or more and can exist on a 1 gig network, but you'll also see that it's going to be quickly ported into 10 gig network because you walk into limitations where you cannot have as many cameras or devices on your network. PTZ control is included in NDI, so that's a very nice addition. It's part of the same protocol. So if the package, so the NDI package, the IP packet carrying the NDI signal comes from A to B, the PTZ control will also be there. So it's nicely encapsulated into the same protocol. But probably one of the nicest things about the NDI protocol in general, independent from NDI, the high bandwidth NDI or NDI HX, is the auto detection functionality, which basically means is that software such as vMix or hardware video mixers with NDI enabled, for instance, can auto detect cameras, meaning that there's less IP knowledge needed because the camera is just going to be automatically detected. So you don't need to type in IP addresses and subnets or even ports. It's all kind of auto negotiated in the protocol. And the good thing about NDI, it is a widely accepted protocol. So there's a lot of different vendors actually supporting this protocol right now, which means that it's definitely interoperable, although probably a little bit less interoperable than the open standards because they're more widely deployed already. But that's also what NDI HX is going to bring to the table. Then looking at open standards, so what is really the difference? So here you can see that we're going from very, very high bandwidth with close to zero latency to where we're reducing the bandwidth and actually getting a little bit more latency. That's kind of the way this graph is explained. Open standards, H.264, H.265, we've talked about this extensively in previous webinars, so I'm going to go through this relatively quick. It basically means is that within these protocols you can do audio and video. Control is a completely separate layer, so it's not part of the protocol. It's completely done separately. It does work very well, and you can decide how high you want to go for bandwidth. So it can exist even on a 100 Mbit network, a 1 gig network, or a 10 gig network. VISC over IP is the control protocol, and it's completely open standard, so there's a lot of deployments for it, but it does require basic knowledge of IP. It is interoperable, so that's the good thing about this protocol. Then if we look back on NDI HX, high bandwidth NDI, one of the things that was could be considered a downside for that protocol, which initially it was developed to really replace SDI infrastructure inside of broadcast organizations. For Pro AV applications, lower bandwidth is fine. We don't need to go to very high bandwidths to actually get our moving video from A to B, because that's what the difference is are you watching content where every detail counts, right? So everything which is on there, think x-rays or medical content, these type of things, where if a little bit of color is missing or a little bit of detail is missing, then it's a problem. Or are you looking at a lecture that's being captured, for instance? Lecture capture is a good example. Latency is not as, latency doesn't need to be zero. There can be some latency, and also it's a matter of optimizing your storage capacity versus the costs that are involved at the same time. NDI HX, so the difference between NDI HX, the last column in this overview, between high bandwidth NDI and NDI HX is NDI HX is software based, so it doesn't use an FPGA. It actually takes the H.264 from the encoder and encapsulates that into the NDI HX protocol. And this is where it's very important to select the right camera, because you would think like any NDI HX camera is an NDI HX camera and they're all going to be just as fast. Well, that's not true, because NDI HX cannot travel back in time. If you know somebody that can, please let him call me, because I'm interested in that type of technology. But NDI HX cannot go back in time. So it takes the H.264 encoded signal from the camera, so the actual encoder built into the camera, and encapsulates that into NDI HX. So Avonic having a very fast camera is an advantage, because we actually hand over the encoded stream to the NDI HX protocol. From a latency perspective, we're seeing kind of like the same type of latency as with open standards, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more. It's always depending on the encoding and decoding side, and that is the advantage of NDI HX, because NDI HX is optimized for the encoder and decoder, because they're both using exactly the same protocol. It is again interoperable, and also it has the auto identification feature. So NDI HX is the logical choice if you look NDI high bandwidth, and if you look at NDI HX, NDI HX is the kind of obvious choice for most Pro AV applications. And that's also why most of the manufacturers in the Pro AV space have adopted NDI HX and not high bandwidth NDI. So short, but still a lot of detail is in this overview. But you can watch this later on. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat window. We have our team ready to answer your questions. But hopefully this was able to position the different technologies. So for NDI, remember, there's a high bandwidth NDI that uses FPGA-based implementation, relatively high bandwidth, and there's NDI HX, which is the standard that Avonic has decided to support. Okay, so now what about NDI HX, right? So we talked about the positioning of NDI HX, but now the most important thing is to really understand what it is, right? So the protocol was originally developed by NewTek, still is the developer of NDI, and the first release was actually already back in 2016. This sounds like ages ago, and actually was ages ago. NDI HX is, as you just saw, the high efficiency version of NDI, the full bandwidth NDI. It's hardware encoding and acceleration. So it takes the H.264 generated by the camera and actually accelerates that and packages it into the NDI HX protocol. It has different bit rates that you can select, because you can still in the camera decide if you want to go whatever 6 megs or 10, or even in our case up to 40 megabits of data, which is the highest that we support. That meaning that it can exist actually on a 100 Mbit Ethernet, which sounds from a long time ago, but if you start counting the number of switches still out there, but typically on a 1 gig network. It's compatible with a lot of different types of software. Companies like vMix, for instance, have implementations. That's actually the tool that we're using now. But there's also other receiving software out there, and there's also NDI tools out there which are developed by NewTek or by NDI, which we're going to be talking about that as well. Inside of the NDI protocol, there's also error resilience, basically meaning that it can cope with some errors inside of the transport between A and B. So if there's some issues with the network connection, it can actually cope with that. And NDI provides an end-to-end latency, and then I need to go a little bit to this direction, in combination with our CM70 IP and vMix of about 80 to 100 milliseconds. So if you calculate that, that will be about 5 to 7 frames using 1080p 60 video. Which is perfectly fine to use. This is don't get things wrong by assuming that, hey, everything that is compressed will always have very high latencies, and these latencies are very, very usable in almost every application that I can actually think of. NDI supports real-time transmissions of both video, audio, and control. So compared to the standard codecs that are out there, it also implements the PTZ control inside of the NDI standards. And NDI includes a UTC timestamp, which also makes sure that there's synchronization between the audio and the video, which is not always part of most of the other standards. So that's the quick introduction about NDI HX. And then, of course, what type of applications can you see NDI being used? Well, for instance, production. So here you're seeing two pictures of a temporary setup. One is more a studio setup where multiple elements from multiple manufacturers are coming together. And with NDI, you can actually connect them all together. They're all auto-detected, so it makes life a lot easier, especially if engineers that are actually running these productions on site don't have all the IP knowledge. This just makes their life a lot easier. Same thing goes for this one, which is a little bit more high profile, I believe in Malta. But also in the esports world, there's a lot of things going on in esports right now. We've just signed a technology or a marketing and technology partnership with a company here in the Netherlands called Gamers First. Inside of these organizations, there's a big push to just go all IP right away because they're fairly new, so they tend to just not go SDI anymore, which is kind of interesting, especially for NDI as well. Of course, churches, house of worship, there's been a lot of, I would say, ad hoc installations, very quick installations, things that would need to go fast, need to be deployed fast. NDI HX does have its position in these spaces. And again, like I said, for instance, with a tool with vMix, it's kind of like a plug and play solution. Education as well. Also, because inside of the NDI tools, you have the ability to actually create a virtual USB input that I'm going to be talking about as well. But NDI is also a standard that's going to be, and more it's going to be accepted by the lecture capture vendors as an input. And of course, also Webinar Studio. So these pictures have a lot in common, but they're definitely not one and the same applications, but they have very much the same requirements. One nice thing about NDI, because NDI is a protocol being used by a lot of different manufacturers, and actually NewTek had decided quite a long time ago already to create their own tools to help the deployment of NDI. A couple of these tools that are available, they're free, and they're available from the website ndi.tv. Some of the tools that are, it's like a one package that you install on your PC. There's a couple of them that I would like to highlight. So the first one is the one that you're actually seeing here, which is the NDI Studio Monitor. This is a very simple tool to view NDI sources on the network. The nice thing about this one is also it includes PTZ control. So you actually have control over the camera as well. So for basic installations or very basic, very quick, maybe rental type installations, it already creates a lot of value. But also for your testing purposes, it gives you the ability to actually see NDI streams without having to go out and buy vMix or others. Then one of the things I mentioned for education, the NDI virtual input. This is a tool which basically takes the NDI signal out of from the network and emulates a virtual USB input in your PC. You're seeing here, I don't know, this looks like a very old picture actually from Skype, but basically this is what it's doing. So it is creating a USB webcam with the nice addition that actually can go up to 1080p 60, which is quite nice. Also, it's compatible with Google Hangouts or Google Meet, GoToMeeting, Skype, Zoom, all kinds of other platforms. So if you have a camera on the far side of the room, you take the NDI signal and you can use that as a USB input using this tool on a PC or a laptop. And then also NDI is working on analysis tools, which is still in beta, which is really for troubleshooting when you start deploying more and more NDI-based systems. Again, the website is ndi.tv and the download is free, so definitely advise you to take a look at this. As soon as our NDI camera or the CM70 NDI starts shipping, then definitely this is a good way to test it and to see what it can actually do and what the NDI protocol brings to the table. So that's for today's webinar. Again, I'm happy that so many of you are joining. We're very excited about this CM70 NDI and supporting the NDI HX protocol. A couple of things that I wanted to just kind of give you as takeaway points from this webinar. So the CM70 NDI is soon going to be released. We're very, very close to release, so you can bet you that we're going to let you know as soon as we have them available for shipping. But the CM70 NDI will be available in white and black. And all features of the CM70 series, and I've highlighted some previously, they are going to be available in the CM70 NDI as well. CM70 NDI will have 2 dedicated SKUs, so part numbers for us, and it is unfortunately not possible to upgrade existing CM70 models. There is a piece of hardware which is in the cameras which we actually changed, so it is going to be a dedicated hardware part. The good thing is your customer doesn't need to go anywhere to get the license. It's already fully charged, it's already running, so as soon as you have an NDI camera in your hand, it actually does NDI as well, so no need to upgrade or get a license. NDI H6 offers efficient transport with within IP-based networks with lower bandwidth compared to or lower bandwidth comparable to full bandwidth NDI. So it significantly reduces the need for high bit rates being used. And this is important because original NDI really comes from the broadcast industry where people were looking for a replacement for SDI cabling. In Pro AV, right, we don't have these big infrastructures, we don't have these big network switches. It has to be affordable, so NDI H6 just takes care of things. Auto detection of NDI cameras simplifies installation and requires less IP knowledge. Basically meaning that your engineers don't need to become IP experts overnight. NDI would definitely help. And NDI is very much suitable for temporary installations, especially for rental installations that you do on a weekly or daily basis. It allows you to just mix and match equipment from different vendors and still have the same type of user experience. NDI is widely adopted. It is a very popular protocol. It's been used in tools like vMix, OBS, but also, for instance, with standalone decoders such as Magewell. Magewell has a line of standalone NDI decoders, very small device. You take in an NDI stream and basically it just gives you an HDMI or SDI output. So a very affordable way just to stream on if it's a dedicated connection from A to B to do it that way as well. And again, there's a range of free tools available from NDI.tv. So that's the webinar for today, our CM70 NDI. We're working on the final things to get the product available for you. So please stay tuned as we make those available in the next couple of weeks. Your questions very much welcome. Thank you for the questions in the chat window. A recording will be made available to all the attendees, but you can also view it later on our YouTube channel. And if you have any questions about our products, if you want to know anything more about availability of the CM70 NDI, just send us an email or contact your local reseller or distributor. There's more webinars to come within the next couple of months here at Avonic, but for now, this was our CM70 NDI webinar. Thank you for watching and hope to see you soon.